Hello. So in this video, we're going to talk about Jean Baudrillard's book, Simulacra and Simulation. This is a 1981 book of philosophy. It's really an interesting one. This is a sort of revolutionary philosophical text, and I would actually be really fascinated to see somebody in the sort of Baudrillard vein update this for the digital era. Because I think that what Baudrillard is doing here is really, really fascinating. And on the one hand, I think the trends he's talking about have vastly accelerated in the information age, the social media age, etc. But at the same time, I wonder if there is somehow not also a breaking apart of the schema that he's constructed in this book. So basically what Baudrillard is interested in here is that the idea that contemporary society has substituted reality as a foundation for the social and replaced it with the sign as the foundation of the social. So what this means basically is the way in which the world is understood and experienced is no longer in modern society rooted in the question of reality. It's rooted in the question of sign systems. It is rooted in the question of representations and models. And this is done through media. Both in terms of like mass media, movies, TV, things like this, which constructs ways in which we can understand the world, but also in terms of things like political rhetoric, news media, things like this, that theoretically serve an explanatory function within the world. So one of the things that he says in sort of explaining this is that it is no longer a question of imitation, nor duplication, nor even parody. It is a question of substituting the signs of the real for the real. That is to say, of an operation of deterring every real process via its operational double, a programmatic, metastable, perfectly descriptive machine that offers all the signs of the real and short-circuits all its vicissitudes. Never again will the real have the chance to produce itself. So that's a little bit vague. And to be honest, Baudrillard's theorization is somewhat difficult here, in part because he seems to use slightly different meanings of words in some places. That may be the translator. That's more of an issue. This was originally written in French. I'm reading an English translation by, let me find the translator, Sheila Faria Glasser. I have no idea if she's a good translator or not. I don't have any reason to doubt it in particular, but when you're translating philosophy and words have very specific technical meanings, I imagine it's extraordinarily difficult to capture the range of meanings from the original language and express it in a different language. But essentially what Baudrillard argues is that rather than... So it's a bit like... One good way of thinking about this might be the gold standard, right? It used to be that we had the gold standard in the U.S. Not all economies have functioned like this across time, but in the U.S. we once had the gold standard. The amount of money that could be printed was limited based on the amount of gold that the U.S. government owned or had access to. It was rooted in something real, even if that real was only sort of virtually real, right? Because gold is not actually... Gold is only worth something because we, as a collective, have decided it's worth something. It's actually not a useful metal. There's very little use value, but it has a lot of symbolic value. right? We've decided that gold is valuable and therefore it is valuable. And so under the system of the gold standard, as long as there was gold, we could print money. You reached a certain point where you had printed the maximum amount of money you could print before the value of each dollar printed started to diminish. Right? The currency capital was rooted in something real, even if that real thing was somewhat arbitrary. We then left the gold standard, and in some ways that's actually economically good, but what it means is that the amount of money that the US government can print is now only limited by the amount of credit that people think the US government has. So as long as people think that the US government can pay its debts if it needs to, we can continue printing money. And the fact that we can continue printing money ultimately sort of reinforces the idea that the US has virtually unlimited credit. And so what we have here is a system of signs that refer only to itself rather than being tied to something real that limits the possibilities of what those sign systems mean. So this is what Baudrillard would call a simulacrum. And he says here, a simulacrum, that is to say, never exchanged for the real, but exchanged for itself in an uninterrupted circuit without reference or circumference. So, again, if we think about this in terms of the gold standard and leaving the gold standard example, all that is necessary for the US dollar to have value is for people to believe that it does. And part of the reason we believe that it does is because the US government has credit. We have virtual ability to pay our debts, and therefore, in practice, we have the ability to pay our debts, but it's not tied to anything real and external. It is a system of signs that reinforces itself and refers only to itself. This is not specifically to critique the US government and US economics. A lot of governments now function this way. But this is what Baudrillard argues is the foundation of contemporary society. We abandon concern with the real in exchange for concern with the sign. And the sign is detached from the real. And the sign instead functions within an economy of other signs, which mutually reinforce one another. And so one of the upshots of this is that it no longer matters what the real is. It no longer matters what morality, what power actually does, how morality, power, whatever it is, actually function. It only matters how they function at the level of signs, how they are constructed to function. And as long as they are perceived as functioning at a certain level, or that they should be functioning at a certain level, their actual functioning is preserved. So he says here at one point, all that capital asks of us is to receive it as rational or to combat it in the name of rationality, to receive it as moral or to combat it in the name of morality, because these are the same, which can be thought of in another way. Formerly, one worked to dissimulate scandal. Today, one works to conceal that there is none. So basically, it does not matter if we're moral, it does not matter if we're rational, it does not matter if what we're doing is good, bad, indifferent, whatever it is, as long as it is done in the name of goodness, in the name of rationality, then that calls into being that goodness, that rationality, by operating at the level of morality, rationality, goodness, truth, whatever it is. We create those things by the very act of of operating at that level. So another good example, and Baudrillard uses this example early in the book. The healthy person who pretends to be sick and then develops symptoms. Are they sick? Yes and no. They are sick because they are experiencing the symptoms, but they are experiencing the symptoms because they pretended to. And so they called into being that creation. They called into being that illness by pretending that it existed. It did not need to exist prior to it. The imagining of it was sufficient. And so one of the things that Baudrillard is really, really concerned with here, one of the things he's really fascinated with, is that the real is replaced by the system of science, right? The simulation or the simulacra. And one of the things this does is it means that power can infinitely maintain itself. And he's not talking like limited, stupid political power or something like this. He's not talking President Joe Biden, Vladimir Putin, Emmanuel Macron, Xi Jinping, whatever. He's not talking about that. What he's talking about is the power through which a social order establishes a framework for society, a way in which society overall functions. It exports the conditions that undercut it in order to deny or ignore, violate the idea of power itself, right? So I'll read you this bit. Maybe that'll help make it a little clearer. Probably not, because Baudrillard's philosophy is, again, fairly difficult, fairly dense. But he says here, power itself has for a long time produced nothing but the signs of its resemblance. And at the same time, another figure of power comes into play, that of a collective demand for signs of power, a holy union that is reconstructed around its disappearance. The whole world adheres to it more or less in terror of the collapse of the political, and in the end the game of power becomes nothing but the critical obsession with power, obsession with its death, obsession with its survival, which increases as it disappears. When it has totally disappeared, we will logically be under the total hallucination of power, a haunting memory that is already in evidence everywhere, expressed at once in the compulsion to get rid of it. No one wants it anymore, everyone unloads it on everyone else, and the panicked nostalgia over its loss. The melancholy of societies without power. This has already stirred up fascism, that overdose of a strong referential in a society that cannot terminate its mourning. So, I actually think this one is fairly interesting, and this one makes a lot of sense to me. This idea that fascism is rooted in a false memory of a society, and the way that fascists appeal to their supporters, to the rank and file, is by the pretense of nostalgia, right? The pretense of a return to the good old days. Make America great again, right? This idea of we'll go back to the golden age. Mussolini promised a return to the grandeur of the Roman Empire. Hitler made all of these historical references. The Nazis constructed an entire mythology of the Aryans, which is completely divorced from real history, from actual historical evidence, and yet this myth making drove their theology, right? A sort of secular theology of fascism, of Nazism. The signs of power, the signs of history, the signs of culture, tradition, heritage, etc., divorced from questions of reality, from questions of truth. It is about the belief in that history, that power, that whatever it is. As long as those sign systems exist and can refer only to themselves, as long as they don't need reality to undergird them, then you have a system, a social system that functions, that runs on the economy of the simulacra. And one of the things that I think Baudrillard would probably point out is that this is not just true of fascism. This is also true of many other social systems. Contemporary liberal representative democracy not being an exception to this. As long as we have sort of the belief and the sign systems that we have freedom and that the government is of the people, by the people, for the people, to quote Abraham Lincoln, then society continues ticking along. But that premise may not be undergirded by reality. And this is what Baudrillard is fascinated by, is that society functions on the basis not of are our sign systems rooted in reality, but in the basis of sign systems in themselves.